spider, every person's worst nightmare. From small to large, it will always be a creepy crawler. And today's story is inspired by our fear for this 8-legged creature, and it is called I Think I Might Be Allergic to Spiders by Pan Kayke. When I was little, I used to garden with my mom. Out in the Florida sun, we sat on our knees, digging our shovels and gloved hands into the rich soil. We always wore gloves, ever since grandma had died from systemic anaphylaxis due to a garden spider bite. We never got to say goodbye or see her body. It was easier to cremate her and not have to see her red-patched, swollen corpse. Since then, gloves were a necessity while gardening, because allergies are often inherited. Sweat dripped down my brow as I peered into my small blue bucket. I had collected 17 worms. I looked up gleefully to show my mom my new friends, but when my eyes met hers, they were filled with fear. Her face was a ghostly white, including her usually rosy cheeks and lips. "Mommy," I asked, following her line of sight. My heart stopped. She had taken off her gloves to grab her water bottle and, sitting on the back of her hand, was a big, fat, blood-red spider. I reached out, hoping to scoop the spider up into my still gloved hands, when my mom held up her other hand, gesturing for me to stop while she kept the spider hand steady. Then suddenly, as if to surprise the spider, she smacked the arachnid as hard and as fast as she could, wincing on impact. After a few moments, she turned to look at me and smiled lovingly. "Don't worry, honey," she said, leaning over to kiss my dirty forehead. "I got it before it got me." I hugged her close, burying my face in her chest, but not before seeing her smile falter ever so slightly. "I love you so much," she whispered, squeezing me tighter as her voice cracked. Later that night, when my father came home, I heard frantic whispering coming from the kitchen. Peeking around the corner, I saw something that scared me more than any monster could. My mother was crying. I had never seen her do that before. In fact, I was sure that moms couldn't even cry at all. But there she was. My dad held her tightly, a grave look plastered on his face. "Should we go to the hospital?" he asked solemnly, like he already knew her answer. "No, no, no, no. Don't you remember what they said about mom? They had no fucking clue what happened to her. Why should it be any different for me?" she managed in between hushed sobs. I want to spend my last moments here, with you." My dad nodded slowly in response, a tear rolling down his cheek. "Okay," he resigned, "but we can't let him see." I jerked my head back into my room. They were talking about me. What couldn't they let me see? Footsteps led up the stairs and into my parents' bedroom. For a while, I could hear their muffled voices laughing and crying together, talking into the wee hours of the morning. I was about to fall asleep when I noticed that the voices had suddenly stopped. Then, a door slammed. It must have been their bathroom door. Heavy, male footsteps made their way down the stairs and approached my door. It creaked open, and for a moment, I could hear the shaky breath of my father. Then he closed the door. I froze and squeezed my tearful eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. It started as a low groan that turned into a series of petrified moans of fear. I heard a fit of sneezing, and then the noise stopped for a moment. That's when the screaming started. I'll never forget the sound of my dying mother shrieking as some mysterious, horrible fate befell her. Eventually, after about an hour and a half, the screams died down into pitiful whimpers before finally coming to an end. There was nothing left but silence. I shook under the covers, crying until morning came. The smell of chocolate chip pancakes filled the house. I tiptoed into the kitchen to see my dad expertly flipping a flapjack without having to use a spatula. He turned his head to look at me, and I knew that something was incredibly wrong. His eyes were rimmed with red, and the dark circles under his eyes might as well have been drawn with a purple Sharpie. His hair was tousled, as if he had been obsessively running his hands through it. That was something he did when he was stressed. "Hey, kiddo. I made your favorite," he said, his voice breaking and his mind 1,000 miles away. I never got the full explanation of what happened to my mother, only that she was gone forever. According to the official report, she died, as did my grandma, of systemic anaphylaxis. Now, I may have been young, but I was old enough to know that allergies, even severe ones, didn't cause people to scream the way my mother did that night. Over the years, I'd simply brushed that night under the rug of my repressed memories. I grew and matured normally into what my mother would have referred to as a handsome young man, despite the early loss of two maternal figures. I graduated with my associates in mortuary science, and I had become a rather successful funeral director by the time I was 30. I was feeling pretty good about myself, especially since I had recently purchased my first house. It was small and far from perfect, but it was mine. On the anniversary of my mother's death, several years after the initial event, I decided to honor her life by planting a small garden in my front yard. It would be a tribute to all of the good times we spent together before she was ripped away from me. I made sure to wear my gloves. Drenched in sweat and more than a little sunburnt, I began to undress for my shower. I dropped my pants and underwear to the floor, then my shirt. I was about to step out of the pile of sweaty clothes when I felt a sharp sting suddenly erupt on my right foot. Shit, I cursed, jerking my foot away. I looked down just in time to see the little fucker scurry away, and I stiffened. The red spider looked exactly like the one that had bitten my mother. But I had been so careful. Not careful enough, I thought to myself. I managed to slow down my breathing enough to focus. What if I inherited the allergy? Should I call an ambulance? Or could I make it to the hospital on my own? What if I'm overreacting? I finally decided to take my shower and see if the bite progressed to anything concerning. I stepped out of the shower, making sure that the spider was nowhere near my feet, and began to towel off. Suddenly I squinted my eyes, drew in a breath, and let out a mighty sneeze. Wiping the snot from my upper lip with my towel, I stood up and carried on my after shower routine. It was 8 o'clock when I felt that tickle in my nose again. Achoo, I exclaimed, expelling another roar of a sneeze that echoed throughout the kitchen. I could still feel a tickle in there, so, being a man, I bypassed a tissue and forcefully deposited my snot rocket into the kitchen sink. My eyes widened. "What the fuck?" I said aloud. Staring back at me from the sink, covered in mucus, was a little red spider. This guy was smaller than the first, but it was unmistakably a spider. I stepped back, then jabbed a finger up my nostril to see if anything else was up there. I felt a tickle on my finger, then a prick. When I pulled it back out, I noticed a raised red bump with a 2-pronged puncture wound. My heart began to pound. A lump of fear rose in my throat. No, wait. That wasn't fear. There was something moving inside my throat. I rushed to the bathroom, hacking and coughing, trying to clear my airways. When I reached the bathroom mirror, I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it down my throat. It was no good. I couldn't see anything at the angle I was at. So, I had the bright idea to take a picture down my throat with the flash on. I wish I hadn't. Sticking up, at the back of my mouth just behind my uvula, was a writhing mass of legs protruding from my throat. I tried to scream, but that only made the legs writhe harder. Finally, I managed to expel a few creatures with a heaving cough enough to scream. Red spiders scurried across the bowl of my sink. I groaned at the sight. I looked up at my reflection, moving in closer to the mirror to examine my face. Every single pore was clogged with a blackhead. I had bad acne when I was a teenager, but I hadn't experienced anything like this. The blackheads littering my skin began to pulsate, as if my pores were breathing. Slowly, spitterlings started to emerge from beneath my face skin, crawling out of my pores and into my nose, mouth, eyes, and ears. I stumbled backward and groped for the shower curtain to support myself. My bite wounds began to throb, and the bugs underneath my skin built up and up until the bites blistered and burst. There were thousands of them, and they just kept coming. I could hear them skittering inside my ear canals. I felt like crying. I couldn't. The moment I thought I felt tears began to rise, I realized that they were not tears at all. 2 giant red spiders reached their long, spindly legs up and out of my tear ducts. My eyes began to bleed. The spiders from the bite wounds crawled over my body, and I could feel all of their legs flitting over my skin frantically. In a last-ditch effort to save myself, I tore off my shirt to see my torso covered in hundreds of red bumps. I felt a pressure build up in my chest, then looked down. Tiny, black, flailing legs started to squeeze their way out of the pinprick holes in my nipples. I was shrieking like a madman when I felt the urge to urinate, followed by the sensation of scurrying in my pants. Oh my god. They were coming from everywhere, everywhere. I know it is too late to call an ambulance, and I know that they would never be able to explain this strange allergy that seems to afflict my family, so I am writing this to you. The spiders are spilling out from under my fingernails onto the keyboard, and I can feel more hatching inside me. My organs, my skin, my skeleton, everything is covered in spiders. I'm sure that in a few hours I'll be reduced to nothing more than millions of spiders in a suit of flesh that used to belong to a human being. Just know that if you're gardening, sometimes gloves aren't enough to protect you, and if you start sneezing after a bite, well, good luck, my friend.